Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski. Hey, I'm going to create a video lecture to kind of introduce you to the concepts of rhetoric and argument. And hopefully you can read on the board here some ideas as I go through rhetoric and argument. But we know that a focus of our class is going to be, for the next 8 weeks, we're going to talk about rhetoric and argument. So before we can talk about argument, we have to talk about rhetoric, because rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can get into argument, we got to talk about how to define the term rhetoric. So the first thing I would do if I was in a ground class is I'd have students take out a piece of paper and I would say, okay, I want you to define the term rhetoric. And it would be pretty funny if you saw some of my classes, because you would see girls crying, guys shaking, people just confused, right? As if some of them may have never heard the term rhetoric. And so I think it's important that if you're in that situation, that we kind of slow down, because some people in my online class may feel like many of my ground students. Some people have never heard the term rhetoric. Some people have heard the term rhetoric that don't know what it means. And then sometimes students come up with some pretty creative definitions of what rhetoric is. So I think if you're confused on what rhetoric is, let's slow down and let's follow on the first thing that I've said here. This is supposed to say, what is rhetoric? This is supposed to say, can we talk about people who use rhetoric? So it's a safe bet that we can say, okay, who are the people? So first we can say, are there people who use rhetoric? And most students will say, yeah, there are people who use rhetoric. So let's figure out who those people are. Who are the people that use rhetoric? And in any class that I take, students can overwhelmingly say, I don't know any idea about rhetoric, but when I say, who are people who use rhetoric? The first people, they will always say this. They'll always say politicians. Politicians always use rhetoric. And so if you think about it, we're getting close to an election. This is an election year. So somewhere along the lines, you might have heard things like Donald Trump is using rhetoric, or Kamala Harris is using rhetoric, or Joe Biden is using rhetoric. So somewhere along the course of the last, hopefully, few months, you kind of heard the term rhetoric, right? You've heard, oh, hey, former Obama has used rhetoric. You don't know what it means, one ear out the other, but we know that politicians use rhetoric. The second group that's always associated with rhetoric is lawyers. Lawyers are always associated with rhetoric. And students always say, right after politicians, I just have to wait for it, they'll say, lawyers use rhetoric, which would make sense, because think what a lawyer does. A lawyer argues a case, right? They may argue your case, right? So that's a great example of someone who uses rhetoric, right, and how it's connected to argument. Okay, so if we can, who else might be some of the other people who use rhetoric? We know politicians, we know lawyers. If you were to take another discipline outside of English, you might take philosophy, because philosophers use rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is often associated with people like Socrates or Aristotle. English teachers use rhetoric, right? And if English teachers use rhetoric, then so do students, and they're not always very good at it. So I just want you to, and then sometimes students will say things like maybe writers use rhetoric. Okay, so all we've done is established this criteria here. Here are the people who use rhetoric, right? Politicians, lawyers, philosophers, teachers, students, writers. Now I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. So what do I mean by a form of rhetoric? Well, we know that politicians use rhetoric. And I always say in my ground class, hey, I'm going to have a guest speaker. He's going to come in right now. We know he uses the rhetoric. I have a guest speaker. I have former President Barack Obama. And I want to say, hey, former Barack Obama, he's coming up here. He's using rhetoric. What's he doing? And students will say things like, he's talking. He's giving a speech. So notice, a form of rhetoric can be a speech. And then I always ask students, how many people have seen former president, or have heard seen former President Obama give a speech? And there was a time when a lot of students would, but not often these days. But I'd say, well, how many of you seen him live in person? And then very few people raise their hand. Well, how is that possible? And they'll see things like TV. So notice, TV can be a form of rhetoric. So a speech might be a form of rhetoric. TV might be a form of rhetoric. What else might be a form of rhetoric? Radio could be a form of rhetoric. If we have writers, then a book could be a form of rhetoric. The internet is the greatest form of rhetoric of all time, right? So notice all I've done here is I've established the people who use rhetoric, and have established forms of rhetoric. Who are the people who use rhetoric? Politicians, lawyers, teachers, philosophers, writers. A form of rhetoric might be a speech, could be TV, radio, internet, books. Now, I'm going to give you my definition of rhetoric, and this will be my definition of rhetoric for the rest of class. And I'm going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. So I'm going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And what I want you to do is to take a little bit about, just think about what we've talked about right now. And what I want you to do is there are 2 other videos that might help you understand rhetoric. And then there's a discussion board, just based on the discussion board and what I've talked about. How would you define rhetoric and why? You can agree with me or you can disagree, but as of week 1, I'm going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And I'm really excited because this will give us something to play with as we kind of examine how rhetoric and argument work. So I'm looking forward to your discussion board posts. I think it's going to be really fun, and we'll go from there.